I'm Insomniac, and this is the SO&CO Tribeca 5059. So another big shout out to Anthony for sending this in. If you've been watching the videos recently, you're definitely getting used to hearing that name a lot. He's sending in a lot of watches to be reviewed, which I appreciate. If anybody else would like to send watches in to be reviewed here on Should I Time This, email me at shoulditimethis@gmail.com. I will let you know where to send the watches. They'll be reviewed, insured, and sent back. Now, before we get into the sections, let me give you a little bit of background as to what a New York style GIMCRACK chronograph is, for those of you who might have been confused by the title. The chronograph part we'll get to later. Right now, let's talk about the New York style part. I live about 20 minutes outside of New York City. I've spent a lot of time there, and nothing about this watch really reminds me of New York. Now, I don't really care about that one way or another. I wasn't expecting to get this watch in my hands and be like, wow, this reminds me exactly of this area of the city. But I guess why that irks me a little bit is because when you go to the Our Story section of the SO&CO website, you get almost zero background at all about this brand as a watch company, and you get paragraphs and paragraphs about New York. Also, feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong and I just missed it, because maybe I browsed the site too quickly, but there does not seem to be an explanation anywhere on their site as to what SO&CO stands for. And Co is probably N Company, at least that's usually what it is, but what's the SO? My assumption after browsing the site is that it actually doesn't stand for anything, and SO&CO is supposed to just be a kind of verbal play on words to remind you of maybe Soho. It's supposed to be kind of trendy, but doesn't really mean anything. Basically, everything about this brand, before I even got to dig into the watch and write the review, seems to just be an emphasis on New York with watches as an afterthought, which is strange, being that they're a watch brand. Hopefully I'm wrong about that and they just did a really crappy job with their info page. We're going to dig into the watch in a second and find out. Before we do that, please make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell. I have a lot more new watch reviews coming up soon. Don't want you to miss any. Yeah, let's dig into the watch. The case on this piece is a perfect storm of wonderfully elegant and cheap. The shape of the case is beautiful, with a double-rounded bezel and classy lug shape. You also have a nice onion-style crown with the SO&CO logo, and a polished set of pushers that look good with this dial and have a decent feel to them when engaging the chronograph. The screw-down case back also features the AND logo and has various information about the watch engraved around the outer edge. And the polishing on this case is pretty well done. It's uniform and has a high degree of shine to it. The glaring issue here is the machining. If you look closely at the case, you'll see that the lines are soft to the point of being bland. It lacks definition. It almost looks like a cheap stamped cast piece of metal that was later polished to give you the impression of quality. So even though they used a great shape and jazzed it up with some decent polish and details, it kind of reminds me of putting a custom paint job and chrome accents on a Hyundai. It's not a bad car, but you're trying to make it look more special than it is. My point being, I wish the quality of this nice looking case were a bit better. The dial on this watch lies somewhere between uninspired and perfect harmony. Everything on the dial is subtle and balanced and neatly done, yet there's no real emphasis on literally anything at all, which comes across as a mix of elegant and bland all at the same time. Let's go through the individual parts and you'll see what I mean. The base of the dial is white, and while the chapter ring around the outer edge is just a clean flat white, the base of the main dial has a subtle diamond textured pattern, so subtle that you barely see it at a glance. You have a black printed minute track on the chapter ring with numerals at every 5-minute interval, but then you have one line between each numeral, which would technically mark every 2.5 minutes or seconds. Why? I've never seen a 2.5 interval, so that's interesting. Below the chapter ring, you have a printed minute track done in a simple black, but there's another curious decision here. You have black dots marking every 5-minute interval right above each Roman numeral on the dial. That would be fine if not for the fact that I just told you there's a set of numerals marking every 5-minute interval right next to it on the chapter ring. And before anybody says the scale on the chapter ring is a tachymeter scale for the chronograph, no it's not. First of all, the main second hand on this dial has nothing to do with the chronograph, so it can't be used to time anything. Second, what tachymeter scale have you seen that uses 2.5 intervals? Anyway, moving on to the Roman numerals, they're a decent font and size, subtly polished in great contrast with the white dial, but they're one of the thinnest sets of applied numerals I've seen. Under the 12, you have an applied SO&CO logo, which looks pretty good here. Then you have your subdials, which all have a flat white backdrop with black printing, and a nice polished ring around each subdial to separate it from the main dial. I do like that. The subdial at 3 o'clock is a 24-hour indicator, while your subdial at 6 o'clock is the second counter for the chronograph, and the subdial at 9 o'clock counts minutes for the chronograph. And you have a date window tucked between the 4 and 5 numerals, black numeral on a white disc, which matches the dial perfectly, to the extent that without any kind of border around the date window, the date almost gets lost on the dial. Last but not least, we have the hands, and bravo to SO&CO here. Well, almost. Their site says they use Dauphine-style hands. The shape of all of the hands, including the ones for the subdials, is very nice and looks great with the aesthetic of this dial. And I actually like the fact that the hands are black as opposed to the standard polished steel that you'd normally expect on a dial like this. The small issue here is that the minute hand is significantly shorter than the second hand, to the extent that you can definitely see where it's pointing, but it's too short for this dial. Long story short, it's a decent looking dial overall, but there's nothing stand out here. It's almost like this brand Googled chrono dial and they went with the generic sum of all the top search results. There are 3 complications on this dial. The date window at 4:30, which although moderately lost in the dial, is large and legible enough that it does its job. The 24-hour indicator at 3 o'clock, which is large enough and easy to read despite lacking any indices for the odd hours, even though they had plenty of room for an extra line between the existing ones. And the chronograph. And here we go with another one of these cheap chrono movements that really isn't much of a chronograph at all. Despite having 3 subdials on the watch and 2 pushers on the case, this is one of those watches that has a large running second hand stemming from the center of the watch, while your chrono second hand is the small subdial at 6 o'clock, and you have a minute counter at 9 o'clock, which actually has a track to show you the individual minutes for a whole half hour. But the second subdial only has markers at every 5-second mark. So if you stop the chronograph anywhere between each 5-second mark, good luck. Figure it out, I guess. And of course, one of the biggest drawbacks to this style of chronograph movement is the fact that as opposed to a proper chronograph, where the large main second hand times the seconds and is visible 24 hours a day, if your minute or hour hand is over the 2 chrono subdials, you can't really see what it counted, which limits when you could even use that function. So the complication that takes up the most real estate on this dial and adds 2 extra buttons to the case really isn't very usable. All 6 of the hands on this watch have lume filling, and as you can see here, even with a full charge, they don't glow very bright and don't last very long. But that isn't the main problem here. The big issue is something that I'm coming across quite often lately, and it drives me nuts. Lume in all the hands and not a speck of lume anywhere on the dial. What good are lume-filled hands if you have no glowing references on the dial whatsoever to indicate where those hands are pointing in the dark? They would have honestly been better off just not putting any lume on this watch. Instead of being useful, it just comes across as putting some lume where you can just for the sake of being able to say that the watch has lume. Time at a glance on this watch is excellent. Despite having a fairly busy dial, the layout is very neat, and the contrast of the black hands, black minute indices, and polished markers against the white backdrop is excellent. And although the minute hand could use a bit more length, all of the hands have fine points at the ends so you can quickly and easily see where they're pointing, so it's a breeze to tell the time quickly on this watch. Accuracy on this piece is what you'd expect from a decent quartz movement. I've had this watch here for a decent stretch of time and it has been perfectly accurate to the minute, needing 0 adjustments. The small issue here is with the look of the movement. The deadbeat second hand has some occasional springiness to the stops, and while it stops pretty much dead on with the minute markers, on the right side of the dial, it literally misses all of the markers on the left side of the dial, which doesn't make the watch any less accurate, but makes the movement look kinda cheap. The strap on this watch isn't the original strap that came with this watch according to the SO&CO website, so just to be fair to the brand, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and give them some free, much needed points here and just give them a 10. If you have one of these pieces with the original strap, feel free to leave a comment below letting other viewers know what you think of the strap that comes with this watch. Last but not least, we have value. The only place that I could find the SO&CO Tribeca 5059 with the white dial specifically is on the SO&CO website, and they had this listed at $359 there. At that price, I would have to censor my opinion on what I think this company might be smoking to ask that for a fairly generic quartz chronograph. But I did find the black dial version on other sites for as low as about $130, so I'm going to base the value section on that price instead. For $130, you're in the average price range for a decent quartz chronograph. And this really is a decent quartz chronograph. But if you're looking for a usable quartz chronograph, there are plenty of cheaper options that are just as nice aesthetically. So what we're really looking at here is a fairly handsome just quartz watch at $130, which still isn't a bad price. But there is so much competition for quartz watches, even kind of dress style quartz watches for $130 or even less, sometimes in the sub $100 category, that you would really have to love the aesthetic of this particular watch to justify spending $130 on it. And as you saw throughout this review, I really could not find any specific, unique kind of standout features of this particular watch to justify buying this over something else. So in my opinion, it's just an average value at that price. So anyway, another big shout out to Anthony for sending this in. I did enjoy spending some time with it because I had never heard of this brand before, so I figured I'd see what they were all about. If you have one of these or anything from this brand and you have an opinion you'd like to lend, please leave it down in the comments. And that's it. I'll see you all at the next one.